Hello, this is Branko Malic of Kali Tribune. In this podcast, we'll say a few words about the notion of identity. Now, there is a lot of talk about identity now, especially in online media or intellectual sphere, in online public. And as regards identity politics, we already had a lot to say to write about it. But the very notion of identity, what this word identity means, we didn't treat so extensively, and this was a mistake. Well, I won't treat it very extensively now also, but I will give some clarification as to what I mean by it and what problems does it pose when used in this identity politics sphere. Namely, identity I will define as that which is outside or that which is manifest to others when we speak on identity in people. And of course, in politics, identity is not understood so much as ontological or metaphysical or logical, let's say, law or notion, but it is purely a political determination, determinant of politics. And identity politics, this identity, this aspect of yourself that you show to others, that is outside aspect of you, is the main aspect. The problem is in identity politics, there is a tendency, indeed, there is a inescapable urge to turn politics into metaphysics, that is to turn around ordo cognoscendi, which is to say in Latin, Latin saying for order of cognition or order of knowledge, so that the first knowledge and the first philosophy or the first understanding would be a political understanding, that is activist understanding for the sake of a certain political action. But if this is metaphysical politics, as indeed it is, this first action is absolute thing. You can't go against it, you can't think around it, you can't counter it. And this is something that is completely improper in the terms of the way the human mind operates and in the way the things stand in reality, in my opinion. Now, when I say identity is what is outside, there is this is in fact, let's say, a value judgment on what identity is, because I think identity values very little, precisely because it is that which is not intrinsic but extrinsic, and its purpose is to be extrinsic. Identity is here in the context of postmodernity and this postmodern identity politics. The identity is here to identify, to say. So when somebody asks you, how do you identify? Sometimes I have a feeling like from that old world movies for about Second World War, when you hear that Ausweisbitte, the pass please, the papers please, with please not being very accented in SS, intoned German. I think that identity is not the basis of freedom, it is a basis of imprisonment. Now, let us not confuse some things. When you say you identify as Englishman, Catholic, Protestant, whatever, I automatically tend not to consider you Englishman, Catholic, or Protestant. because being Englishman is not an identity. It is what Mr. or Madam X is. This is a mode of being, a mode of human being, his or her ethnicity. This is not an identity, in my opinion at least. The reason for this is that identity is a synthetic activity. Synthetic meaning here the activity of permanent endeavor to create a union of opposites. That is, it is a creative act. It is not an act of stating the matters or stating the essence of what somebody is. As some of those critics of alt-right, of even of Nazism and fascism, make a great mistake because they are same kind of idiots usually if they are on the left, and they say you essentialize. Well, maybe they are not mistaken if they are consequent with their notions. Namely, essentialize means to create in a way an essence, a quidditas of thing, of what is something. So you essentialize, I am for instance Croat, and I say I am Croat. Somebody says he is a Croat. He is, as most Croats are, a gloomy, boring, and passively aggressive idiot. Which is a sentence that I can agree to some extent when applied to Croats. This would be essentializing, but now consider that this is not uncovering of the real essence of what this ethnicity is, but of projecting this ethnicity, of explaining it and founding it in some way. And this is what this act of essentializing I don't consider relevant. It is relevant as a political act, not as a metaphysical act, because in essence, in my opinion, what we are is not something what we create. In no way, shape or form, and this precisely is related to our ethnicity and religion and such things. Much of those things are inherited, and they are real inheritance, not imaginary, not half imaginary, but real. Only it has to be uncovered and taken up as a burden and a blessing at the same time. Now, to clarify this murky concept analysis, identity is an activity. Identifying is a human activity. And you will see it all over. I think somebody listening to this maybe already had a dawn of illumination because he's on the internet forums, spends much time there. You always see this. I am identifying as Croat. I am identifying as alt-right. I am identifying as a pink unicorn. Everybody is identifying. Now what this means? This means giving expression to what you want to be. And now, in our day and age, identity politics is a manifestation of this false notion that people can indeed choose what they are. No, I don't agree with this position. They could if they would have been devoid of given essence, of given existence, of given synthesis of essence and existence. Their real identity in quotation marks. Now I will just make a brief excursion into philosophy here, because it would take much more than one short talk to get into this. But there was a philosophy, a metaphysics in the history of spiritual, in a spiritual history, that is history of philosophy, that had put identity in the forefront of everything. And this was classical German idealism, the so-called heroic age of philosophy, because this was the last time that philosophy uh, really held the sway over masses. Not, excuse me, not really masses, but uh, people who could act to change the world, even from the position of power or position of seeking power, was later in revolutionary movements that sprang out partly under inspiration of classical German idealism. And this is tremendously interesting and difficult period to investigate. The main philosophers are Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel. Those are three most famous, but hardly the only ones. They are the genesis of this philosophical movement is vast. It encompasses, in the first place, Kant, then interpretation of Baruch de Spinoza, German Romanticism, and so on and so forth. I can, of course, won't go into this. Well, what I want to say is that identity in German idealists, especially, for instance, Fichte and Schelling, in early philosophical works that were written at the end, at approximately 1895 to 1795 to 18, first decade of the 80s, of the 19th century, were in fact the essays on the problem of identity, how to explain the synthesis that identity is, how to explain identity as an act. So, for instance, when Schelling takes the statement A equals A, he will go on to write a whole book about the sign equals, because this equality of the same is not a static equality for them. It's not, identity is not static. It is a process and it is a synthesis. And to cut a very long story short, the main identity for German idealism to be solved and to be proven as existent is identities of subject and object. That is, the I, which is a principle of this philosophy, and the world. How to show that I is real and eternal, and that the world is conscious and deliberately ordered. Now, fast forward to our age. Of course, German idealism is understood now as obsolete, as something of antiquarian interest. I beg to disagree, but be that as it may, many modern so-called philosophers festered on the carcass of this great philosophical period. People like Derrida and others, Michel Foucault, they had this relationship towards German idealism and the people who came after it in the aftermath of its dissolution, like Marx, Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, and others. Now, you can see here something that is taken up, for instance, by alt-right, who take this identity as a synthesis, as an active synthesis of pure I, as a principle of everything, as a principle of human being at least. But in this kind of thinking, the being is identity. The being is that by which is everything that is. This is the definition of being. The definition, excuse me, this is a metaphoric definition, because being transcends genera. It cannot be defined, but you can give it this approximate definition. For them, it is a racial identity, for instance. And racial identity, in effect, is not biological. And as I said earlier, Richard Spencer is very open about it. And this is metaphysical notion. This is the notion of creating one's own being. And this is one of the reasons why I think that alt-right and post-Nazism, which is very closely tied to it, if not identical, has a future. Political future. Because it taps into egoism of the age. Almost absolute egoism. It taps perfectly, for instance, in post-humanism, which is also dialectical, very notion of dialectics of conscious and unconscious, where you want to make unconscious conscious, and when you want to make a conscious but finite thing infinite, by using matter to turn a conscious being as a human in a robot, because a robot can practically exist forever. I mean, this is extreme of terminus of lunacy. But all those movements are very close in this sense, because they are all based on subject and activity of subject, of its will and imagination. So identity is created, and this is why I did this podcast, to make a difference. Because some people ask me about you, tell me you identify as blah blah blah. I don't identify as anybody unless police is interrogating me, and then I lie, which I don't do in normal situations. What man is, what defines man, is something else. It is living soul, in my opinion. It is an intellect. It is nous, intellectus. But if you beg to differ, no matter. But consider this. It is not an identity, because identity is by definition superficial. Yeah, it even rhymes. It is superficial thing. It is an act. And it ceases to exist unless it is produced perpetually. Now, imagine what a tiresome work that would have been when you have to produce your identity throughout all your life. And this is something that groups as alt-right and such people in fact propose. Because they will be proven wrong on every occasion by the very essence of human being. And the attributes and properties of this essence, which are, for instance, ethnicity and race and so on, which they want to make fluid and redefine according to their will. Note that their opponents claim that race is a social construct. They both claim this. And this is why I'm talking about that the identity in this sense, as it is used today, is an ability to show your papers to the police. Literally. Identifying. Who wants to do that? This is the point why I do this podcast. And to make an announcement, maybe this is a good opportunity to say that in the future there will be talk about German idealism. I'm postponing it because it is a great work. It requires a lot of time and attention, not to get things wrong. Those are among the most difficult thinkers and most difficult writers ever that ever walked this earth, from Hegel, Schelling, and others. And I'm a little bit rusty because there is a lot of water passed under the bridge since I last opened Schelling's work, for instance. But we'll go into it. The second part of the synchronicity essay, synchronicity research, is in the works as of today, in real works. So I hope it would be over at the beginning of next week. So, hope you found this in the short podcast interesting. This was Branko Malic from Kali Tribune. Support Kali Tribune. Make it professional.